Roberto Carlos is exactly what Isaac Newton warned us about 300 years ago. It's the 3rd of June, 1997. A pre-World Cup tournament in France called Le Tournoi, Brazil against France. A free kick is awarded roughly 35 meters from goal. Roberto Carlos stands over the ball. The wall lines up. The goalkeeper sets his feet. A ball boy standing behind the goal, directly in line with the trajectory, flinches and ducks out of the way because the initial flight of the ball is heading straight at him. Not at the goal, at the ball boy. Then the ball curves. It curves in a way that should not be physically possible from the distance and the angle and the speed at which it was struck. It bends so far and so late that the goalkeeper doesn't move, not because he's slow, because his brain cannot process what his eyes are showing him. The ball enters the top corner of the net with the entire stadium trying to understand what just happened. What has he done?
Dear, dear! I don't believe it! What a goal we have just seen from Roberto Carlos!
Roberto Carlos. That is impossible. Except it wasn't impossible. It was physics. And the man who explained exactly why that ball moved the way it did had been dead for 270 years by the time the free kick was taken. In 1687, Isaac Newton published a book called Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. It is, without exaggeration, one of the 3 or 4 most important books ever written by a human being. Newton laid out 3 laws of motion and a theory of universal gravitation that fundamentally rewrote humanity's understanding of how objects move through space. Before Newton, the physical world was governed by observation and intuition. After Newton, it was governed by mathematics. He didn't describe nature. He gave us the equations that nature follows. His first law states that an object in motion stays in motion in a straight line unless acted upon by an external force. His second law states that force equals mass times acceleration. His third law states that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. These 3 principles, written in Latin by a man who barely left Cambridge, explain everything from why planets orbit the sun to why a football struck with enough spin at the right angle can curve 3 meters laterally across 35 meters of open air and beat a professional goalkeeper who had a clear line of sight from the moment the ball left the foot. To understand what Roberto Carlos represents, you need to understand the position he was supposed to play and the limitations that position was supposed to carry. A left back in the mid-1990s had a clearly defined job. You defended, you tracked wingers, you held your position in the defensive line. If you were good going forward, that meant overlapping occasionally and delivering a cross. The great left backs of the era before Roberto Carlos were measured by their discipline and their reliability. They were functional players in a structural role. Nobody expected a left back to be the most exciting player on the pitch. Nobody expected a left back to have the most powerful shot in the squad. Nobody expected a left back to score goals that physicists would write research papers about. Roberto Carlos ignored every single one of those expectations from the day he arrived at the highest level of the game. Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration, is the principle that makes Roberto Carlos make sense when nothing about him should. He stood 5'6". In a sport where physical dominance is traditionally associated with height and reach, Roberto Carlos was built like a sprinter who had been compressed into a smaller frame. His thighs were measured at 61 centimeters in circumference. That is not a normal human measurement. That is the muscular density of someone whose body had been engineered through genetics and relentless physical training to generate force at a ratio that completely contradicted what his frame suggested was possible. When he struck a football, the combination of leg speed and muscular power behind the contact produced ball speeds that were independently measured at over 105 miles per hour. To put that number in context, the average Premier League free kick travels at roughly 65 to 70 miles per hour. Roberto Carlos was hitting the ball 40% harder than the average professional footballer. From a body that was 4 inches shorter than most of his teammates, Newton would have understood immediately. Force is not about size. Force is about mass multiplied by acceleration. If the mass behind the strike is dense enough and the acceleration of the leg is fast enough, a smaller body can generate significantly more power than a larger one moving at lower velocity. Roberto Carlos was the living proof of Newton's second law applied to a football pitch, and the sport had no framework for processing what that meant. The 1997 free kick against France is the moment the world realized something was structurally different about this player. But the physics of why that ball behaved the way it did weren't properly explained until years later. In 2010, a group of physicists at the University of Lyon published a paper in the New Journal of Physics that specifically analyzed the Roberto Carlos free kick using fluid dynamics models. What they found confirmed what Newton's laws had always predicted. When Roberto Carlos struck the ball, he made contact with the outside of his left foot at an angle that imparted an enormous amount of side spin. The ball initially traveled in what appeared to be a straight line heading wide of the goal, but as air resistance began acting on the spinning surface of the ball, a phenomenon now widely referred to as the Magnus effect took over. The side of the ball spinning into the oncoming air created higher air pressure on one side and lower pressure on the other. This pressure differential generated a lateral force that pushed the ball sideways through the air, and because the ball was gradually decelerating due to drag, the ratio of lateral force to forward velocity increased as the ball traveled, meaning the curve became more pronounced the closer the ball got to the goal. In simpler terms, the ball didn't just curve, it curved more the further it traveled. That's why the goalkeeper didn't move. His brain was calculating the trajectory based on the first phase of the ball's flight, when it was still moving fast enough that the spin hadn't taken full effect. By the time the curve became visible, the ball was already past him. Newton's first law says an object moves in a straight line unless an external force acts on it. The external forces acting on Roberto Carlos's free kick were air resistance, the pressure differential created by the spin, and gravity. Three invisible forces combining in real time to produce a result that looked like the ball had changed its mind in midair. It wasn't magic. It was Newtonian mechanics operating at a level that professional football had simply never witnessed before. But here's where Newton's framework reveals something deeper about Roberto Carlos than just one free kick. Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, explains not just how Roberto Carlos played football, but why his existence changed what the sport believed a defender could be. Before Roberto Carlos, the action of a left back was defensive. The reaction the sport expected was defensive contribution. Stay back, hold your width, do your job. Roberto Carlos reversed the equation entirely. His action was offensive. His runs from the left back position carried such speed and such violence that opponents were forced to react to him rather than the other way around. He turned a defensive position to an attacking weapon so consistently and so devastatingly that the entire tactical landscape of how teams used their fullbacks had to be reconsidered. At Real Madrid, where he spent 11 seasons from 1996 to 2007, Roberto Carlos became one of the defining players of the Galacticos era. He won 3 Champions League titles. He won 4 La Liga titles. He played alongside Zidane, Ronaldo, Figo, and Raul, and on any given night, he was capable of producing the most spectacular moment on a pitch full of the most spectacular footballers on the planet. His left foot wasn't just powerful, it was unpredictable in a way that Newton would have appreciated, because unpredictability in physics simply means a system with more variables than the observer can track in real time. Goalkeepers couldn't read his shots because the combination of power, spin, and angle he generated on every strike created too many possible trajectories for a human brain to process before the ball arrived. He scored free kicks that bent around walls from distances most players wouldn't attempt to shoot from. He hit strikes from open play that flew in from 40 yards with so much velocity that goalkeepers could only watch. He once scored a goal against Tenerife, where the ball swerved so dramatically that replays from 3 different angles still don't make it look like the ball and the net are part of the same physical reality. For Brazil, Roberto Carlos earned 125 caps across more than a decade as the undisputed starting left back. He was part of the 2002 World Cup winning squad that is still considered one of the most talented national teams ever assembled. Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, Cafu on the opposite flank, and Roberto Carlos bombing forward from the left with the same ferocity he brought to every club match he'd ever played. He played in 3 World Cups and stood as the heartbeat of the Brazilian defense during a period when Brazil's attacking talent was so absurdly gifted that being recognized as essential in that team while playing at left back tells you everything about how irreplaceable he was. In a squad where everyone could do something extraordinary with a football, Roberto Carlos was the one doing things that nobody else on the planet could replicate. Newton spent years fighting with the scientific establishment over whether his laws were actually correct. Gottfried Leibniz challenged his calculus. Robert Hooke claimed priority on gravity. The Royal Society was divided for decades over whether Newton's mathematical model of the universe was genuinely superior to the philosophical frameworks that had preceded it. Newton didn't argue about it. He just kept publishing proofs. Eventually, the proofs became so overwhelming that arguing against them became an act of willful ignorance rather than legitimate scientific disagreement. Roberto Carlos experienced a version of the same resistance. Throughout his career, purists questioned whether what he did was sustainable, whether his attacking instincts created too much defensive vulnerability, whether a left back who played with that much offensive freedom was actually helping his team or simply entertaining the crowd at the expense of structural integrity. The 3 Champions League winners' medals were his proof. The 125 international caps were his proof. The World Cup was his proof. He kept providing evidence, and the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. Newton's deepest insight wasn't any individual law. It was the realization that the universe operates on principles that are consistent and predictable if you have the right equations. The same force that makes an apple fall from a tree is the force that keeps the moon in orbit around the Earth. The scale changes, the principle doesn't. Roberto Carlos applied that same consistency to football. The same left foot that scored free kicks from 35 meters delivered crosses from the byline. The same explosive acceleration that powered his overlapping runs allowed him to recover defensively when he was caught out of position. The same physical density that generated 105 miles per hour strikes allowed him to hold off wingers twice his height in one-on-one duels. One set of physical attributes applied across every dimension of the game at every scale, with the same underlying mechanics producing the same result, regardless of context. Newton gave us the equations that govern how objects move through space. Roberto Carlos spent 15 years proving that a football struck with enough force and enough spin by someone who understood the physics instinctively, even if he'd never read a single page of the Principia, could do things that the entire sport had assumed were beyond the laws of the game. They weren't beyond the laws. They were the laws. Newton wrote them down 3 centuries before Roberto Carlos ever laced up a boot. Football just hadn't been paying attention.